It's late evening. The house is finally quiet. The news is on low volume in the background. Someone scrolls through headlines, half interested, half tired. They've seen this cycle before: economic uncertainty, cultural shifts, technology changing everything again. And instead of panic, there's a subtle sigh. Not because they don't care, but because they've lived through enough change to know the world always feels like it's ending before it rearranges itself. If you were born roughly between 1965 and 1980, this might feel familiar. This is the psychology of Generation X, the most misunderstood, least talked about, quietly resilient generation alive today. And by the end of this video, you might understand why Gen X doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Gen X grew up between two giants. On one side, the baby boomers, a generation defined by numbers, cultural revolutions, and visibility. On the other, millennials, a generation shaped by digital identity, self-expression, and constant connectivity. Gen X sat in the middle, and psychologically, being in the middle does something to you. They weren't the celebrated youth movement. They weren't the internet natives. They weren't handed a clear cultural narrative about who they were supposed to be. So they built one quietly. Many Gen Xers were what psychologists sometimes call latchkey kids, both parents working, coming home to an empty house, microwaving their own dinner, figuring things out alone. This wasn't necessarily traumatic for everyone, but it created a generation wired for self-reliance. When no one is hovering over you, you learn two things fast. 1. How to handle yourself. 2. How not to expect too much from systems. That second part is important. Gen X is often labeled cynical, but there's a difference between cynicism and informed skepticism. They grew up watching the Cold War anxiety, the fall of the Berlin Wall, corporate scandals, political promises dissolve, the dot-com boom and bust, September 11th, the 2008 financial crisis. Every major institution, government, corporations, media, has at some point failed publicly during their adult lives. When you repeatedly witness instability in authority structures, your brain adapts. You stop assuming stability. You start scanning for inconsistencies. Psychologically, this builds what we might call defensive realism. Gen X doesn't expect things to work perfectly. They plan for things to break. That's not negativity. That's experience. Gen X is the last generation that remembers life fully before the internet, and the first that had to fully adapt to it as adults. They played outside until streetlights came on. They used payphones. They waited for photos to be developed. They experienced boredom without a device to fill it. And then suddenly the world digitized. This created a unique cognitive flexibility. Neuroscience tells us that brains shaped by slower, less fragmented stimulation often develop stronger, sustained attention. But brains forced to adapt later in life develop adaptability under pressure. Gen X had both. They remember depth, and they learn speed. That dual wiring is rare. It's why many Gen Xers can unplug without panic, but also function fluently in a digital environment. They weren't born into constant visibility, so they don't feel dependent on it. And psychologically, that reduces comparison anxiety. One thing you'll notice: Gen X doesn't overshare, not because they don't feel deeply, but because they were socialized in a world where privacy was normal. Before social media, your mistakes weren't archived. Your teenage phases weren't documented publicly. Your identity wasn't curated in real time. So vulnerability was something shared in small rooms, not broadcasted. Psychologically, this builds a strong internal processing system. Instead of asking, "How does this look?" Gen X is more likely to ask, "How does this feel?" That doesn't mean they're emotionally perfect. but it does mean they often develop internal resilience instead of external validation loops. For many Gen Xers, work is important, but not necessarily their entire identity. They entered adulthood during economic volatility. Layoffs were real. Loyalty didn't always protect you, so they developed what psychologists call conditional commitment. They'll work hard, but they don't assume the company will protect them. This is why Gen X professionals often keep backup plans, develop side skills, stay quietly prepared. They don't romanticize corporate life, they navigate it. And because many were responsible early, caring for siblings, managing themselves, competence became part of their psychological security. If I can handle things, I'll be okay. That belief runs deep. Gen X isn't always the most openly expressive generation. They weren't raised in a culture that normalized constant emotional articulation. Therapy wasn't mainstream. Mental health conversations weren't common dinner topics. So many learned to process emotions privately. But here's the nuance. Just because someone doesn't broadcast their emotions doesn't mean they don't feel them intensely. In fact, Gen X loyalty tends to be strong and long-term. They may not post about friendships daily, but they'll show up when it matters. Psychologically, early independence can create a don't rely too heavily on others pattern. But once trust is established, it's solid. They don't collect connections, they keep them. Now, many Gen Xers find themselves in a psychologically complex position, caring for aging parents, supporting children, maintaining careers. They're the bridge, and bridges carry weight from both directions. This can create chronic low-grade stress, not dramatic breakdown stress, but constant responsibility stress. Because they were raised to handle things quietly, many Gen Xers internalize pressure instead of externalizing it. They don't always say, this is too much. They just manage it. But that doesn't mean it isn't heavy. Have you noticed Gen X humor? Dry, dark, observational, a little detached. Humor is often a psychological defense. When you grow up in unpredictability, divorce rates rising, economic shifts, cultural instability, humor becomes a regulator. It creates distance from chaos. It says, I see how absurd this is. And that distance is calming. It's not apathy. It's emotional self-protection. Some people say Gen X is disengaged, but disengagement isn't the same as disinterest. Gen X simply doesn't perform engagement loudly. They don't feel compelled to narrate every opinion. They don't chase trends to stay visible. They've lived long enough to see trends fade. So psychologically, they conserve energy. When you've experienced enough cycles, you stop reacting to every wave. You choose which ones are worth paddling into. If we had to summarize the core psychological trait of Gen X, it might be this: internal stability over external validation. They don't need constant applause. They don't panic without attention. They can sit in a quiet room without reaching for noise. That capacity, the ability to tolerate stillness, is rare in a hyper-stimulated culture. It's a nervous system shaped before constant digital interruption. And that matters because in times of cultural chaos, the most valuable people aren't always the loudest. They're the steady ones. Every adaptation has a cost. Self-reliance can become emotional isolation. Skepticism can become guardedness. Independence can make asking for help feel uncomfortable. If you were raised to handle things alone, vulnerability can feel unnatural. And sometimes Gen X carries stress longer than they should, because they don't want to burden anyone. The strength becomes the shield, and the shield sometimes blocks connection. That's where awareness matters. So, what is the psychology of Gen X? It's the psychology of growing up analog and adapting digital. Learning independence early, trusting cautiously, loving deeply but privately, planning for instability, handling things without making a spectacle of it. It's a generation that doesn't shout its identity, it just lives it. And maybe that's why it's often overlooked. But overlooked doesn't mean unimportant. In many ways, Gen X is the stabilizer generation, quietly competent, emotionally contained, adaptable under pressure, resilient without announcement. If you're Gen X and you've ever felt unseen in the generational conversation, maybe this explains why. And if you're not Gen X, maybe this helps you understand the steady person in your life who rarely complains, rarely posts, but always shows up. The psychology of Gen X isn't flashy, it's grounded, and in a world addicted to noise, grounded is powerful. If this helped you understand yourself or someone around you a little better, let us know. Share your thoughts below, especially if something here felt familiar. And if you enjoy exploring the psychology behind different generations and personalities, stick around. There's more coming. Thanks for being here. We'll see you in the next one.